Hi, I'm Jenna, and I'll be talking about wine production. So, as a brief overview, the Encyclopedia Britannica groups wine production into three major steps. And so you have the harvest of the grapes, and then you have crushing them, and then you have fermenting them. And then some textbooks, such as Understanding Food, which you might be familiar with, also adds racking and aging to that process. The two are different because racking is letting the wine sit so that the sediment or like the died off yeast and other materials will settle out of it as much as possible, and then the wine is drawn out so it is as pure as possible, even though some sediment will still remain, and then it is aged. That more pure wine gets aging, depending if it's red or white, because red wine is usually aged longer because it tends to have earthier tones. When you age wine, the fruitier notes in that wine are the first to go as it ages, and so white wine, which is usually desired to be a little more fruitier tasting, is not aged for as long. So, we're going to go a little more in depth into harvesting and crushing and fermenting the grapes. So, wine grapes are harvested when their sugar content is going to be the highest. And if you took nutrition classes, you may remember that the ripeness of a fruit impacts how much fruit sugar is currently present and what it tastes like. So, they are harvested, and this sugar is what's going to feed those yeasts. Yeast need fuel to perform fermentation, specifically carbohydrates, and so in wine, those carbs are those fruit sugars, and fermentation is controlled by that, and so the yeast will die off by like autolysis when there is no more sugar left to feed them, or they will, settle down as sediment. And so after this harvest, they are washed and crushed and added to fermentation tanks. More yeast is usually added with them because a small amount of yeast tends to be present, like just on top of the grapes normally. So to make sure that they will ferment fully, we add some more like commercial yeast to the wine. And so as those yeasts absorb that fruit sugar, they're going to be releasing carbon dioxide and alcohol, which is where we get that in the wine. And later I'm going to talk about in a second how the process can be a little more hands-on or almost look like a factory setting, depending on how local that it is or how outsourced places that you get the grapes from. Yes, and so after fermentation, wine is racked, and then it is drawn out and aged for a little bit, and then it is bottled and shipped to consumers. So, increasingly, wine production is veering more towards the sustainability side. There were two studies which I have cited in my paper and also in the slides that specifically looked at how customers are starting to desire more environmentally safe, sustainable wine production. And so that can mean things like less water is used and less like pesticides, things like that in their production. And so at the very end, I compared two Portuguese wines for a little bit of a look into how wine can be either very commercial or very local. So one of these manufacturers grew the grapes, harvested them on the same farm, and then he, like his farmhouse and the factory for processing the grapes was right there in that same farm. And so it's all done in one place from one place, and a lot like less commercial processes were used for the actual steps of this winemaking versus for another type of Portuguese wine. Grapes were outsourced from several different areas and brought into one factory, which was not near the farm where the grapes were grown. And then a lot of commercial processes were used between start to finish. So the like solids in the wine were separated by a centrifuge, and other kinds of machines were used in that. And then rather than storing all of the end product at once, wine was shipped out according to demand, because for that amount of commercial winemaking, the storage costs could be pretty high. So Yes, and there are your fun facts about winemaking. And I hope you guys enjoy the information. And we are on to part 4.